is bringing your finding aid into the 21st century, our institution's process of reparative description. And we have with us today Laura Romans and Amanda Touchstone from the University of Tennessee Libraries, and they're going to discuss some of the work that they did while they were on quarantine during COVID. So I will turn it over to y'all. If anyone has any questions, if you could please put it in the chat. You could also make sure that your microphone is on mute, and this session is also being recorded. So I will turn it over. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much for that. If folks will give me just a second to share my screen, and then we'll get started. All right, hopefully everyone's able to see my screen now. So thanks everyone for being here, and thanks to STA for a great program so far, and we're happy to be a part of it. I'm Laura Romans, and I'm joined by my colleague Amanda Touchstone. Today, we'll be sharing with you a recent project we undertook to review the finding aids of our manuscripts collections. While we looked for a variety of issues, one of our focal points was reparative description, or identifying and rectifying problematic language in order to have more inclusive and accurate descriptions. We'll start today's talk by sharing a little bit about our department and each of our roles for contextual purposes. I will then talk about the impetus for this project, followed by Amanda going into detail about our workflow and some of our findings. We will then share how we see this work helping us in the future. Our hope today is that this discussion will inspire others to consider similar projects, and we will have time at the end for any questions that you might have.
All right, hello, I'm Amanda. Unfortunately, my dog has chosen this exact moment to eat, so if you can hear him, I'm very sorry. I want to start by talking a little bit about our department. Officially, we are the University of Tennessee Betsy B. Creekmore Special Collections and University Archives. Say that 3 times fast, I cannot. We are home to a manuscript collection, a rare book collection, a modern political archives, as well as the university archives. We have a full-time staff of 10, where that's comprised of faculty and paraprofessional positions. And then we also have many student workers and a graduate assistant. Oftentimes our student workers outnumber the staff, and that's how we're fortunate enough to get a lot of stuff done. We have modernized a little bit over the years, but this is a picture of what we used to look like when we were in Hoskins Library.
So as the manuscripts archivist, I oversee our manuscripts collections. We have over 3,000 manuscripts collections, and they total over 5,000 linear feet. And these are collections that primarily document the history, the culture, and the people of East Tennessee and the Great Smoky Mountains. The majority of these collections are paper-based, though we do collect material in all formats. So, like most of you, we are regularly processing both new and backlog collections, and we're constantly reprocessing collections for a variety of reasons. The bulk of my position is to prioritize, plan, oversee, and review these processing projects, and a lot of that I do in coordination with Amanda. But I do also sort of oversee the full life cycle of our manuscripts collections, so that includes assisting with acquisitions, as well as facilitating the use of our collections. And this is done through things like reference requests, instruction sessions, creating digital collections, curating exhibits, and all the other outreach things that we all do. And you'll see on the left a very awkward photo of me getting ready to do an exhibit install.
Laura can't be the only one with an awkward photo in this slide. This is when we went to oversee a collection that had been dropped off, and we were assured that it was in great shape and just a couple boxes. Neither of those things were true. My official title is the Acquisitions Assistant, and I've been with UT since early 2015. I'm responsible for accessioning all purchases and donations to our rare book and manuscript collections, and occasionally do accessions for university archives as well. I work closely with Laura on manuscript priorities and processing. I supervise our manuscript student workers, review finding aids before they're published, sort and pre-process large collections like the one on the right, and then also work our departmental reference desk and field reference questions that come directly to me. So I'm heavily involved in the manuscript side, but also do a little bit of everything.
So now that you have a little bit of info and context about who we are and what we do, I'd like to switch gears and chat about description for a little bit. So even though we follow standards, both national ones like DACS and institutional ones like our own processing guidelines, description, as we know, can have many idiosyncrasies. It's impossible to completely remove ourselves, our experiences, and our subjectivities when working with and describing collections. Staffing changes, trends in the field, simply the passage of time can result in ever-changing description practices. Our finding aids are the access point for our researchers as they determine what material may be relevant to their needs. Therefore, our choices in description directly affect the researcher experience. We also know that description is a process, not a product, and it's also iterative. Our finding aids are living documents that are meant to be responsive and revised over time, especially in light of new information. So we do regularly update our finding aids for manuscripts collections, but this is often done in spontaneous moments. A researcher notices that something is mislabeled, or a colleague using a collection sees that something is incorrect. But through moments like these, we've known anecdotally that our descriptions do contain errors and they can include problematic language. This is typically seen in regard to how people from minority populations are described, and it's especially in contextual notes supplied by the finding aid author, like the abstract, the scope and contents, and the biographical historical notes. An example of this I came across early on in our collections was in our biographical note for Tennessee author James Agee, for whom we have around 20 collections. Agee was married 3 times in his life. In the old biographical note, his wives were listed as thus: his first wife, Olivia; his second wife, Alma, who bore him his first son; and his third wife, Mia, who gave him 3 children. This sexist language insinuating that his wife's purpose was to bear him children felt really unnecessary to me. Instead, we changed the language to simply list that he was married to Olivia from 1933 to 1938. He was then married to Alma from 1938 to 1941, and they had a son. And he was married to Mia from 1946 until his death in 1955, and they had 3 children. So in March, our library administration made the decision for everyone to begin working remotely due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Like most of you all, I'm sure, we were tasked with pivoting our time and our energy to different projects that didn't require working in person with our collections. Identifying feasible remote projects felt especially crucial to Amanda and I, as we had 4 part-time student workers at the time who worked with us, and we were told that they could continue working and do so remotely if we had, quote, necessary work for them to do. So in addition to some smaller projects, we brainstormed an ambitious goal to review every completed And by completed, I mean publicly available manuscripts finding aid. There were multiple reasons this project seemed necessary. In addition to the need for remote work for both us and our students, we were in the process of transitioning our finding aid records from Archivist Toolkit to archive space. So any extra time with this new database would be advantageous. With over 3,000 publicly available finding aids, some of which were written decades ago, we knew that there were many that probably don't get looked at very often, with errors going unnoticed. And perhaps most importantly, identifying and updating problematic language in our descriptions had been a task that we had been talking about, but had never really formulated a strategic plan for. So this project was the first time for us that we were going to systematically take a look at every manuscript's finding aid. This was exciting, but also very overwhelming. Two ways that we combated this feeling of overwhelming. One, we set the goal for progress, not perfection. And two, we just started. While we wanted to focus on reparative description, we also felt it was important to use this project to catch as many issues as seemed feasible. Amanda and I worked together to identify examples of problems that we felt would be the most common: outdated, problematic, or exclusive language, grammatical issues, and missing fields. But in addition to pointing out these potential problems to look for, we mainly instructed our students to just look for anything weird or out of the ordinary.
They found plenty of weird and out of the ordinary things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the project workflow and how we made that work. We tracked the whole thing through Google Sheets. We created a Google Drive that Laura and I and our students all had access to and worked within that. We used one workbook per 1,000 finding aids, with each tab being 100. This kept note-taking and distribution of the work a lot easier and more manageable to keep up with. We had 4 students working on this project. When a student finished one tab, they would move to the next one that hadn't been started. And each of our students had a thing or an issue that really bothered them. And it got to the point I could tell during review who had done what span of 100 based on what they're being really nitpicky about. We also had Zoom meetings as needed, both to touch base on this project and with each other. We're fortunate to have close working relationships with our students, and it was hard and an adjustment to not be together as much as we were used to. The worksheets had columns for the finding aid number, what the issue was. If a finding aid had more than one issue, it got multiple lines, and then a column to denote whether or not we've made the correction or if there's a note that we need to look at it further. And I have an example of this on the next slide. Then we reviewed the issues and either made corrections or noted if we need to look at it closer. Because we are remote, there were some questions about box size that maybe didn't seem right, or collection size. So we've made notes to go back and look at those when we can. I started the correction phase of this project. Our students will likely finish that. And believe it or not, the review of over 3,000 finding aids was the fast part. Actually making these changes is taking a lot longer. I think right now we're somewhere in the thousands. And then this is pulled directly from one of the spreadsheets that we used, starting in the thousands. You can see how the issues are denoted, and on 1002, you can see that it had multiple things that we needed to fix, and then the column for whether or not that correction has been made. And some statistics. The total number of published finding aids that we reviewed in this project was 3,240. This does not include our no finding aids, which are collections that have numbers but nothing published to go along with them. The total problem numbers for all of our finding aids, we had 63 instances of outdated language regarding race, 13 instances of outdated language regarding sex, 1,141 instances of grammatical errors or typos, and 591 collections that were missing required fields in their published finding aids. The review portion of this took around 6 months with 2 to 4 students working on it at any given time. When we went remote in March, we had 4. 1 graduated in May, 1 graduated in August, and now we're down to 2, and they finished up what was left and will likely be the ones to pick up making the corrections.
So as Amanda mentioned, this project isn't totally complete because we're still working to fix those issues that were identified. But we felt like this project was a good foundation for us to keep moving forward. Now, this project was not perfect, and our finding aids aren't and can't be perfect. There are no doubt some gaps in this work. We're all human, so there's bound to be issues that were missed. Some of the potential errors, like Amanda mentioned, that we found would best be addressed by looking at the physical collections. But we couldn't do that while we've been working remotely. But like I said before, our goal for this project was progress, and we feel that we've accomplished that. The issues that we did find can inform us as we continue to improve our descriptions so that they are more accurate and more inclusive, both in the creation of new finding aids, but also in setting up secondary phases of this project. For example, we can now compile common harmful words or phrases that our students found in this review, and we can run a search for those to find finding aids that have those words or phrases that we didn't catch this time around. There were several benefits to this project. Firstly, updating this language creates more accurate description that better represents the creators and the material. It also improves search results, which directly affects our researchers as well as ourselves when we're needing to search our own collections for reference assistance, exhibit planning, etc. And I also think that it reduces the risk of excluding any current or potential users, stakeholders, or donors who might see harmful language in our descriptions and equate that with a lack of care on our part. There were also a few of what I'll call selfish benefits to this project as well. It was a really great remote work project that many people, including our students, could be working on simultaneously. It also provided us the opportunity to familiarize ourselves with older collections or collections that just don't get used as much. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, we recently moved to using archive space. So this provided a crash course, both using the front end and seeing how our finding aids present to the public, but also in getting more comfortable with the back end as we edited the finding aids. So Amanda and I are not experts at this, but we recognize the importance of reparative description, not only as an example of upholding the dynamic and responsive nature of archival description, but to also help us work toward our archives as an inclusive space. We wanted to share our journey of doing this work, however imperfect it may be, in the hope that it will inspire you to think about how you might incorporate similar work at your institution. Inclusive description, conscious editing, reparative description, it has several names, but it is a growing topic in the archival field, and that means that there is a growing number of resources available. As we close, we wanted to highlight a couple resources that informed our work and our presentation. The Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia document Anti-Racist Description Resources was a good foundational document that we used when we started our work, and it helped us identify inclusive language that we could use. The Sunshine State Digital Network out of Florida also has some really wonderful resources. As the DPLA service hub for Florida, their work is focused on metadata practices for digital objects, but I feel like much of their material can be more broadly applied to all descriptive work. Two specific things from them that I'd like to highlight include their inclusive metadata and conscious editing resources list, which can be found under their documentation tab. This is a very comprehensive list of scholarship, tools, and resources related to inclusive description. I've also found their Introduction to Conscious Editing video series to be very helpful, especially the first installment, which featured a great talk by Dorothy Berry, the Digital Collections Program Manager with Harvard, who gave some really concrete examples of reparative description, as well as sensible steps for how to start projects like these. And we'd like to close by showing our appreciation to our really wonderful student workers who helped and worked on this project: Miranda, Katie, Grace, and Holly. So thanks everyone, and we're happy to answer any questions that people might have, or to hear if other people are doing similar type of work.
So do you want me to read it to you, or would you like to read it? Okay, so we have a couple questions going in. Obviously compliments too for the wonderful work. But Sarah asks, so your work is primarily focusing on updating outdated and harmful terms and descriptions just in finding aids. What's your suggestion for encountering harmful language when transcribing primary sources?
That's a good question. And we have encountered that in a couple of ways, both in having actual transcriptions of documents. And in that case, we've just left it as is, because obviously a transcription, to me, it is what it is. And so we're not supplying any sort of layer to it. But one thing that did come up several times as we were doing this with our finding aids was that previous finding aid authors had often included quotations or transcriptions of material, or of phrases or things in their descriptions. So in the abstract or the scope and contents, as a way to describe the material, they included a quotation from the material. But for whatever reason, maybe, I don't know, for different reasons that we're not sure of, a lot of times the actual quotation marks were not there. So to a researcher, this would read as, not a quote, but just how the finding aid author was describing the item, which is definitely problematic. So that's an example of things that we marked to go back to and to double check the original source and make sure that that is a quote, to make sure that the quote is correct, and to also decide if it's necessary to keep that quote in the description or not.
I have Bridget would like to know, how standardized is the language you're using?
So I guess we don't really have, we didn't necessarily come up with a like standardized vocabulary or document for when we're making the changes, but we used a lot of the resources that I shared. A lot of those have sort of standard examples or like suggestions of what they think that you should use. And so those were things that we looked to when we were making the changes. And I also think that some of this does, while on one hand it can be done at sort of a broad level, it does also have a little bit of dependency on the collection itself. So there is a little bit of judgment to be done when you're making those changes at the collection level. But I would recommend checking out some of those resources to see what other, places are using and the vocabulary that they are suggesting. And I see that Carolyn shared, there are definitely, this isn't something that we've done, but I've seen this done in several other places. She shared DPLA's Black Women's Suffrage Portal. I also know, I think Yale has one, and I'm sure there are many others who have acknowledgement statements somewhere on their website or their finding aids database or somewhere that it sort of acknowledges the potential of harmful language in their descriptions, or maybe more specifically, like the earlier question, things that might come up in, transcriptions or when you're looking at the actual documents themselves.
And then I was just going to ask a question that you mentioned that you had to go through a number of older finding aids and of collections that hadn't been used in a long time. And I'm wondering if by revisiting some of these finding aids, if you found any gems that perhaps like were sitting there all along and all of a sudden you're like, hey, this is definitely something better than what we thought it was.
Well, again, I would somewhat stress that, we were only doing this based off of the descriptions. So there is still a little bit of, there's sort of that missing piece of like not being able to look at the physical collection. So, that also is part of it. I'm sure we have all been there when you read a description of something and you're like really excited to look at the collection, and then you pull it and you're like, wow, the person who described this was like pretty embellishing as to how they were describing what this actually is. But I will say that I think I have definitely found things that I've marked as like, okay, I need to look at this again. I'm definitely not familiar with this. This sounds interesting. I want to take a look at it, especially in thinking about collections to potentially digitize. I feel like that was a common thing for me as I'm going back through, is to sort of see some things that we maybe haven't really paid much attention to, and that I think might be worth taking a closer look at. So I definitely have a growing list of things, of collections to take a closer look at when I can spend more time with them in person.
And then Ashley asks, have you dealt with indexes or reference works and/or reference works? For instance, Ashley deals with cemetery surveys created in the 1960s that use outdated terms to describe race of those buried in particular cemeteries. Later editions use modern language, but the original is still in daily use.
So I'll say that I personally have not dealt with a lot of that. So I would open that up to if there's anyone else here who has dealt with those things.
Thanks. Sarah also says that she's indexing marriages with outdated terminology as well. So I guess maybe perhaps do you have a suggestion for these individuals and their projects moving forward with various indexes and reference sources that are a little antiquated?
I would say one thing, you know, in my personal opinion, I think, especially when you're doing that finding aid layer or that description layer, is to think about how you can kind of marry those terms, for lack of like a better word. But so, you know, to really think about like, is it worth potentially including those terms as well as whatever the updated term might be? And to sort of think about like the end user, what people who are researching with those tools or using those tools, what terms might they be using? Because I think users, it might also depend on the audience, because I think for researchers who are very well versed in a topic, they might be understanding and know what those outdated terms might be. And so they're maybe used to using those to help them find what they're looking for. But that can also then, if you think about, you know, we work a lot with undergraduate students who are just in freshman English classes and need to look for things. So they might not be as aware of those terms. So I think maybe just thinking about, is there use in both in your description, using both?
I would think too that you could put more or less a disclaimer on it. So if you can say like, this record, this index utilizes language that our department no longer uses. We use X terms, whereas this record uses X term. But again, like you do have to preserve what it is. You can't just change it because like retroactively, that's not really what our jobs are. So I think you do have to find a way to walk that line.
Okay. All right. And in the comments can also suggest something about using maybe a disclaimer, and suggest that it's good to maybe have both of those layers, because advanced researchers will probably still be using the same types of terms. So do we have any other questions from anybody? All right. Well, again, we appreciate you for showing up to our third presentation. Amanda and Laura, really appreciate you presenting for us.